Message filtering in CometChat is nice and simple, but sometimes it's essential when you're building out an application. In this video, we're going to explore how to filter messages by users or groups or even keywords. Let's get started. We'll start on the CometChat website and head over to Developers and Documentation. We're going to be looking at the JavaScript SDK. So let's head over to SDKs and to JavaScript on the web. We'll head to messaging and we're going to select additional message filters. Additional message filters are an important part of CometChat because they allow you to control what users see in terms of the messaging itself. This includes how many messages a user might be able to view at one time, or what types of messages a user can see inside of a conversation or a group, as well as excluding certain types of messages from, say, blocked users, as well as updating messages or even hiding them from certain users and groups as well. Now, in order to do all of this, we're going to be using the message request class. It's something that we need to become more familiar with in order to fetch messages based on the parameters we provide to it. It works in terms of the builder design pattern. This design pattern means that we use the message request builder class in the message request class. Now, this might seem a little bit confusing, but in essence, we use the message builder to then create a message request, which we use to fetch the messages. Nice and simple. So let's have a look at how this would happen. Normally, the first step would be to create the object using the message request builder class. This is where we're setting all the parameters we wish to set in order to get the messages we want. Once we've completed this step, we're going to call the build method. And this build method, as part of the message request builder, will generate a brand new object. And this object itself is used for the message request. Then we'll be using the methods of fetchNext as well as fetchPrevious as part of this call to grab the specific messages with the parameters we've created. Now they work a little bit different, where the fetchNext will return messages after the specified parameters and the fetchPrevious will do the opposite. We'll have a look at more of this in a minute, but in terms of this, there is a few limitations on what we can do. Since messages are used using pagination, we have a maximum of 100 messages that can ever be pulled at one time. But this will just mean that you need to call the fetchPrevious or fetchNext method once more as part of the message request object to get the next series of messages. Let's start having a look at how we can utilize this inside of VS Code. This is the previous project we had. You can download this in the description. We're going to grab the last 50 messages as our first test with message filtering. In order to do this, we're going to create a new variable here called letMessagesRequest equal new CometChat.messagesRequestBuilder. Here we can create a few variables. We'll start with our first one, setLimit50, which will limit it to 50 messages. Now we can build it. This class is now ready to use, so let's give it a shot. Let's call it, and we'll call messagesRequest.fetchPrevious, fetching the previous 50 messages. Then we'll actually grab that request and pull out the messages value, and we'll console log it out. I've just passed in messages.fetched, and then I'm going to pass in the value messages, and we can give this a test inside of our Chrome browser. Here I've got an instance of this running, and we can see that when we refresh and check the console, we've got a no fetch messages, and this is because we don't have enough values here to reference what we're fetching. So let's update this to fetch specific messages for a specific user. I'm going to set the user ID here to be Adrian, one that we created earlier. We've sent quite a few messages here back and forth. And immediately we can see that we've got 13 messages sent across, and we can view those messages. They've all been pulled out. While that's not 50, we could search up to 50 of them, and this has come out successfully. This is just the beginning though. We can now update some of these parameters and how it works. Let's actually fetch the next 50 messages and see what happens. When we try to do this, you'll see that it doesn't actually work. This is because when you're fetching next, you have to pass in an additional parameter, such as an ID or such as a date, so that you're fetching the next messages after that specific parameter. We can test this out in a second, but before we go on, let's actually update a few of these values to see how they work. Firstly, let's create a value here for the user ID, and we'll apply this as a variable when we're setting the user ID. We can also do groups. So if you want to set a group ID, simply update the user ID to a group ID and pass in the value for that, and that will also work. The next thing that I'd like to do is test out fetching the next messages after a specific point in time. Now, a good practice is usually to use the message ID. So let's give this a shot. What we'll do is create a brand new value here. Let's do let message ID, and we'll start off with just number 1, since I know that there is definitely a number 1 message. We'll set the limit here to 30 as a value as well that we can update in the future, and we'll pass all these values in. For the message ID, it's a simple command here of set message ID, and we'll pass in the message ID value. Now we can have a look at how this comes out in our console log. We can see that fetchPrevious from previous IDs of 0 comes out to nothing, because obviously there are no messages before the ID of 1. But we can do fetchNext, and now we can see the fetchNext command has worked. We've pulled out 12 messages after the ID of number 1. This is why it's not 13, it's just 12. Now let's take a look at creating a time zone as part of the filtered messages. Time zones are calculated using the Unix timestamp in seconds. We can see an example of this when we let the timestamp equal, well, whatever this date here is. I'm not too sure, so let's actually find out what the date is right now. We can do this by calling date.now and getting the value in milliseconds. We can remove this millisecond value to a second value by dividing it by 1000. Let's place this in, and this is right now. Now this value we can pass into our message request builder, and what we're going to do is call the method setTimestamp. Now in here we'll pass in the value, and this will be using a reference of this timestamp to search up the messages. Let's comment out the message ID, and this time what we'll do is open up console log and have a look at what messages we get next. And here we can see that next we don't get any messages because I haven't sent any after this point in time. Let's try fetchPrevious. And when we do fetchPrevious, well, those 13 messages that I've previously sent now show up. This is how we use the timestamps to filter messages. Let's take a look at another value that allows us to filter different types of messages. This one here is to check whether messages are read or unread. Using setUnread with a boolean of true will allow us to only view messages which have been unread. We can also set this to false to showcase only messages which have been read. Both of these values can be useful if you only want to display new or old messages per se. Occasionally, users want to block other users from sending them messages. This is where the next parameter comes into play, where you can specifically ensure that you hide messages from blocked users using the hide messages from blocked users parameter. When set to true as a boolean, this will make sure that any messages from certain users which have been blocked will be hidden. Let's test this out with Superhero1, which has sent Adrian a few messages. We have 30 messages here, so he's spamming them a lot. And these 30 messages are currently quite annoying and always popping up constantly. We'll jump into the REST API. Under blocked users and under Adrian's user ID, we'll add Superhero1 as a blocked user. This has been successful, and we can see that this request, which would normally be done by the backend, has successfully blocked SuperUser1 on Adrian's account. Now Adrian specifically can avoid messages from him when we use the parameter to block those messages. When we refresh the page, we can see that they're no longer popping up, which is absolutely great. Now if we want them to show up once more, we'll need to unblock Superhero1 from Adrian's account. We can do this as well in the REST API. Normally, if you want to test this out yourself, just copy in the API key for the REST system, as well as all the other variables, such as the user ID here being Adrian, and the blocked to unblock user being Superhero1, and select to try and call this. Great, this has been updated, and Superhero1 is no longer blocked by Adrian. Now he can view all the messages, and they're all coming through just fine. Let's take a look at some of the other parameters that we can use inside of the filtering options here. There is another one that is called setUpdatedAfter. And this is using the timestamp so that you can only search for messages after they've been updated based on this timestamp. Updates can include things such as if a message has been marked for read or delivered or edited or even deleted. Since this can come back with quite a lot of messages, there is another parameter we can set as a boolean called updates only true. This will make sure that we're only getting messages that are updated from that point in time, rather than every message that has been sent and received from that specific point in time. There are lots of different types of categories of messages. So being able to set the category type of messages that you want to filter for is also important. You can set this as an array, and there's quite a lot of options here, such as text or image or video or audio. If you want to have a look at the full list of options, what you can do is pull up the website, which I'll link in the description below, which shows all the different types of categories of messages. And you can use these just as plain text inside of an array and select which ones you want to look up. We can also filter messages by tag or with tags, which are two separate different things. Let's have a look at both. Let's first of all create some tags, and we're gonna do that just over here. I'm just going to create an array here, and for the array we'll do tag 1 and tag 2. Now this array here that we'll use, we've actually used in the past before somewhere in here. So I'm just gonna write in tags search. Now as part of this, I'm going to pass in a command here called set tags. And here I'm gonna put our tags to search. This will search any messages with these specific two tags in here. But sometimes you don't want to be that specific. You just want to search if a message has any tag at all. And this is where we can pass in with tags as a boolean and set that to true. This can work in conjunction together, or it can work by itself, or it can work independently. But both of these work slightly different, so make sure that you apply which one you need to based on the situation. Let's have a look at a number of other options here in terms of message conversation, something we haven't quite looked at yet. First of all, when you do have message conversations, you might get nesting happening. And this is where it might be useful to be able to hide these sorts of conversations. To hide a conversation, we're simply going to do hide replies. When we pass this in as a boolean, we're not going to be able to see those threaded conversations. But in another situation, maybe you might want to look up a specific thread or a specific conversation. You can do this simply by passing in set parent message ID and pass in the message ID that you want to search up, such as the ID of number 1. If there are any children conversations inside of this message ID, they will be presented as part of the thread. Finally, you might sometimes want to show deleted messages. This is kind of rare, but it really depends on how you're building your application. So the final command we can look at here is hide deleted messages to true or to false. And this will allow you to showcase if messages have been deleted and if those messages are available for you to see as well to fetch them, and decide how you want to present that. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. In the next video, we'll start having a look at conversations inside of CometChat. You'll be able to check out that video just over here. Beautiful.